Good afternoon. I'm Jim Ray with the Road to the Autry Masters. I'm here with Mateo Romero. He is a artist in the Masters in the American West, and I'm gonna share a little bit of his background with you. Contemporary Pueblo painter Mateo Romero was born and raised in Berkeley, California. Although his cultural background is an urban one, through his father, Santiago Romero, and his connection with their Southern Caribbean Cocotte people. This experience includes much of the Rio Grande Pueblo world as well. Mateo attended Dartmouth College and studied with acclaimed artist Ben Frank Moss and Varujan Bogosian. He received an MFA in printmaking from the University of New Mexico. Mateo is an award-winning artist who has exhibited internationally in Canada and the United States. He's currently a Dubin Fellow in painting at the School of American Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Paints in his studio in Santa Fe and lives in Pojoaque, Pueblo with his wife, Melissa, and their children, Eric, Povey, and Rain. Mateo, welcome. I hope I didn't butcher too many of those words as we go through.
Not at all. Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your artistic background, how you kind of came to be an artist, what influences you've got, and just a little bit about your history.
Sure. Well, my background is similar to, I think, many Pueblo artists. I grew up in a family of artists, and my father, Santiago Romero, was a Dunn School painter in the Dunn School, the Santa Fe Indian School. And his mother, my grandmother, Teresita Chavez Romero, was a Cochiti Pueblo polychrome artist,
wow.
a polychrome revivalist in the 50s and 60s. So there's a lineage that I emerged from of really vibrant, interesting native artists. And my brother, Diego Romero, is also an acclaimed potter. So there was a kind of dynamic where I was surrounded by very interesting and artistic people at a very young age. And I think maybe unconsciously, I didn't even realize that I had an art trajectory in my life, but it was sort of framed by these really interesting people around me that were doing really interesting work. And I think I just internalized that as a young child and began, finding my own voice and expressing myself and sort of even maybe mimicking the people around me and just observing the behavior of the studio art practice of all these really interesting people.
That's an amazing upbringing, and to be surrounded by that much creative energy, I can imagine that has a real impact on one's frame of reference. How old were you when you first realized that you were playing around with art?
I was doing it my entire life, but I don't think I really consciously realized it so much until I got to high school and maybe even college, as an undergrad. I think it's sort of an unconscious thing, really, that for me, that I was in this very fecund state of creativity, and I was surrounded by people that were, doing really interesting things, and I think I internalized it. It's very visual, and there's an idea that Pueblo potters have, which you hear reiterated a lot, and it may even seem on some levels like it could be a cliche at this point because people have said it so often, but I think it actually has still a lot of meaning. Pueblo potters talk about being very young oftentimes, and their grandmother or their grandfather will give them a piece of clay. And my wife has this story. Melissa Talachi is part of Pojoaque, Santa Clara, San Juan lineage. She's my wife, and she's also the granddaughter of Luteria Tencio from San Juan Okeawinge. She's also the granddaughter of Petra Gutierrez from Santa Clara. So she's very much a mud woman. And one of the stories she tells is about being a young child and having her grandmother give her a small piece of clay and just having her work the clay, and sort of being at the kitchen table at a hut house, and a very basic table with an oilcloth over it and people working, and you observe the older people in your family, in your community, just using their hands. It's a nonverbal experience, right? So I think a lot of what happened with me was sort of a corollary to that. I think it was a nonverbal experience where you grew up in a family of really creative people, and they're using their hands all the time. They're looking at things with their eyes, and they're pontificating with their minds, and they're using their hands to create things, to draw and paint and make pottery and do all this amazing stuff. So at a very young age, I began drawing, and that was my primary form of expression. And I don't think I really consciously realized it until I was much older, maybe in high school. It was maybe 15 or 16 when I realized that I was actually, part of an art family, that I was an extension of a kind of legacy in art.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about your art. I'm going to loosely refer to you as a contemporary Native American artist. I'm also going to loosely refer to you as I'm not going to call you abstract because what you do is representational, but it's it's highly impressionistic. And I'll give warning to our viewers. I'm gonna lay these artworks on top of the video in post-production, but looking at the images up close really doesn't do them justice because they are impressionistic. You need to step away so that you can get the whole scene that is trying to be described. Would you say that's a fair characterization?
I think so. I would actually call them expressionistic. There's elements of expressionism in them. They're very gestural. They're very associated with movement and motion. The surfaces are very physical, and they're very muscular. They're heavily painted. They're oil paintings done with palette knife, almost exclusively done with a palette knife. So the surfaces are, a quarter inch to a half inch thick. They're very athletic surfaces. There is an element of impressionism in that some of the landscapes will deal with lighting. So there's impressionistic moments as well. In particular, there's dawn paintings and dusk paintings that have very oblique horizontal lighting situations where the light's placed in certain areas and the shadows are kind of juxtaposed. So they have expressionistic moments, they have impressionistic moments. They do actually look much more interesting in person. They're very physical.
Yeah. So you've said that your landscapes are an indigenous critique of space. You want to comment on that?
Absolutely. So these are regional landscapes. They're in northern New Mexico, exclusively northern New Mexico landscapes. They occur above Santa Fe and through Abiquiu and through Taos and through Ghost Ranch in that area. There's Rio Chama. But, being a Pueblo person from this area, being a northern Rio Grande Pueblo person, you also realize that these are part of an etymology, that there's an existing name, indigenous naming of all these spaces. And that's actually covered in the titles of the paintings. So, for instance, when I do paintings around Santa Fe, instead of titling them Santa Fe Landscape #1, I would say something like Ogopoge Ewinge, which is the Tewa word for Santa Fe. And it means, Ewinge is a suffix in Tewa, which means village of, and Ogopoge is white shell water place. So that's actually the pre-existing indigenous name for Santa Fe. And I use those names whenever I can, whenever possible, because I believe it points to an indigenous critique of space. And the indigenous critique of space is this. It is that there is a Western European canon of space, and it exists in landscape painting and figure ground painting. It exists in the history of Western European Renaissance painting. And it's based on the sublime. It's based on man's positioning outside of the landscape in a relationship of a sort of awe and reverence and kind of, almost like a voyeuristic moment. It's the sublime. The aesthetic is referred to as that. And in the Rio Grande Pueblo worldview, there is not a positioning of man as being distinct outside of the landscape. Man is actually sublimated and woman within the landscape. So Alfonso Ortiz talks about it in Tewa World. And the title of his book, Tewa World, is Time, Space, and Becoming. And that really is, the essence of it, that these landscapes are, for me, they're moments of my connection with the landscape in a very direct way. They're not distinct. I'm not distinct from the landscape that I paint. And the indigenous critique speaks to a moment in time when none of us were essentially distinct from the landscape. We're all considered part of it. The Tewa have a term, poha, which means breath of life. And that's a force that moves through everything. It's a force of energy. It's about life. It's about creation. And it moves through people. It moves through rocks. It moves through rivers. It moves through stones. And it is actually what I believe connects us to the environment and to the planet and to the landscape. And those are, my ideas about the indigenous landscape. That's why I bring forward the indigenous names of the places and the titles as a sort of entryway into talking about this different idea about space.
There's one of the paintings that I have here that does not have an indigenous name, and that's Taos Gorge. What can you tell us about Taos Gorge?
It actually has an indigenous name too. I just don't know it.
Okay, fair enough.
At one point, one of my relatives told me what the Taos name for the Tewa name for Taos is, but I just forgot. So that's just my own, that's my own foible, right? It also has an indigenous name.
Yeah. So certainly an iconic part of the landscape around Taos. You cannot miss it if you're there. The first one that you mentioned, I think, was and you're going to have to help me here, Ogapoge? Ogapoge.
Yes.
Which I take it as a desert scene. Is that correct?
Yeah, these are all regional northern New Mexico. So they're all taken from Santa Fe through Abiquiu and Taos. It's high desert, right? It's above, Cochiti, for instance, is below Santa Fe in elevation, and I would not think of it as a high desert, but mostly what I'm painting is regional high desert scenes. The deserts of, we associate this stuff with probably O'Keeffe, right? That they're Ghost Ranch, Rio Chama, Abiquiu, Taos, the mountains in Taos, things like that.
Right. Yeah, this is a little bit more. It looks to me like a more close-up vision, a more of a macro vision. And when we go over to Siping, again, you're going to have to help me here.
Siping Awinge.
Siping, it's exactly how it looks. Awinge.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a longer mountainous view.
Yeah, that's O'Keeffe's El Pedronal scene. That's actually the site of a historic Tewa ruin, an Anasazi ruin. And so the Tewa in this area referred to it as Tsi being Awinge. Tsi is flint, being is mountain, and Awinge is village of. So there's actually a ruin on the outskirts of El Pedronal.
Very cool. So what inspires you when you see a scene? When do you know that you see something that you want to approach as an artist?
I'm looking for very specific things which I think are kind of visual, but they are also kind of emotional. I'm looking for interesting compositions. We have, like in the Siping Awinge painting you're talking about, there's a classic tabletop mesa,
right,
which we associate with northern New Mexico. So I'm looking for compositions which have that, and also in the Siping Awinge stuff, you find that it has water elements and there's land and sky, which I find interesting as a landscape painter to be able to combine those three elements together into a picture plane. I think that's kind of engaging. when you look at the landscapes, you know, I drive up to Pagosa quite a bit, and I hang out in the hot springs of Pagosa with my kids and my wife. And you notice that everything changes in Colorado. The colors are much less vibrant, and the spaces are more, the hills are more rounded. So in northern New Mexico, and in particular in the Abiquiu area, there's an amazing amount of color that doesn't really occur anywhere else. It's, you know, primary golds and yellows and oranges and these wonderful pinks. And if you get south into places like Laguna and Acoma, they also have beautiful northern New Mexico landscapes, but they're much more like yellow ochre and iron oxide and burnt sienna, right? They're more like earth color. But up in Abiquiu and the Rio Chama area, Ghost Ranch, even Taos, the color is actually more exaggerated and it's more high key. They're more primary cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, cadmium red. So that's part of it too, is that the actual source, you know, if you're looking at a landscape, you're looking at a composition, but you're also looking at the color, and there's remarkable colors that come out in that area in particular. So I'm very attuned to high key colors which occur in landscapes, which don't really happen anywhere else. I mean, you travel, you know, the rest of the planet, you don't find this kind of super primary vibrant color emerging. The other thing which you see here, which is I think really unique, is the clouds. You know, we're very high up.
I was just going to mention that the clouds in New Mexico are amazing.
They're amazing, and if you look at older Pueblo pottery, that's a recurring cloud motif. They have the cumulus cloud motif, right? It's like a line that comes across at the bottom.
Really tall cumulus.
Yeah, it's a line that comes across with a series of billowing clouds that just come up. And that shows up in all sorts of historic Pueblo pottery, and that's a very alive notion. You know, it's something from the history of Pueblo pottery, but it's also very now. It's this moment in time. I go out and look at this stuff, and I do sketching, and I do hiking, and part of these landscapes are based in remembered landscape, and sometimes I use occasionally some photographic source too, and I compile these things or composites. And part of it is that cloud motif from the pots. When I get to the skies, I am thinking about this cumulus cloud, these billowing sort of, you know, geometric pottery depictions of how the clouds looked.
Yeah. So do you sense that that your creative energy is going through any kind of evolution, or is it pretty much same old, same old? How do you sense your creative energies might be changing over time?
Well, you know, these landscapes you're talking about are transition in themselves. Earlier on, you know, maybe 6 years ago and previous, I was doing mixed media photographic transfer painting, and they had Pueblo dancers on them and plains dancers and all sorts of, you know, Indians on horses and things. So it was much more figure ground, and it had a stronger, you know, this photographic presence. So the work I'm doing now is actually 6 years ago. If you looked at it, you would understand that this was the transition that I made. And I'm just trying to more of the.
I think at this point, I'm going to have to say thank you, Mateo, for joining us here. And I think we lost a little bit of your audio in the very last part of it, but I sure appreciate your taking some time to talk with us. And I hope that we get a chance to see you in February at the Masters of the American West.
Absolutely. Thank you.